Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Turning the Page. And I'm Siddhartha Talya, and it's my privilege once again to be speaking to Mr. Gurjit Singh. He's been an Indian ambassador to Germany, to Timor-Leste, to Indonesia, and also to the ASEAN. And in the context of this book that we're going to speak about today, the Durian Flavour, authored by him, India and ASEAN after a decade of the Act East policy. We'll, of course, be discussing how the ties between India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has evolved since the ASEAN was born in the year 1967. Of course, a lot of our discussion will also be focused on recent developments. Many thanks once again, Ambassador Singh, for speaking to Times Now and appearing on Turning the Page. And congratulations once again on another book. And thank you for speaking to us. Let me begin, sir, by asking you, and in fact, quoting you from the preface of the book. You say, and I quote, "The durian is an unstated symbol of contradictions in human preferences that need to mesh for real enjoyment." You add by saying that the India-ASEAN relationship perhaps reflects this in regional ties. The time is nigh to overcome the anxiety of the aroma and bite into the fruit. So therefore, in that context, sir, let me ask you, what have been the key anxieties on both sides that have prevented India-ASEAN ties from achieving their full potential?
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you for having me. Thank you for reading the book. And very happy to be on Turning the Page once again. So, very clearly in the book, I have said the main concern that I have is that we, India and ASEAN, despite both being members of the global south, do not treat each other that way. And our major problem is that we look over each other's shoulder beyond. India looks at Japan, Australia, South Korea. They look at West Asia. It's time that we look directly at each other in your own eyes and say, what can we do together for our people, which almost 2 billion people live between us? That to me is the major problem. There are other issues like the China factor, the difference of perception on trade, and the difference of perception on the Indo-Pacific. But I think nothing to my mind is more difficult than this challenge of looking beyond each other.
Well, that's nicely put, and that's precisely what I was going to come to. And let's look at what ASEAN has been doing when looking over its shoulder. The China factor obviously looms very large. So therefore, can you share your perspective about what appears to be a very glaring contradiction in the ASEAN-China relationship? Now, there are territorial disputes in the South China Sea between various countries within ASEAN and China, and you dwell upon this in the book as well. The Paracel Islands are claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The Spratly Islands are claimed by China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Brunei, and the Philippines. The Scarborough Shoal is claimed by the Philippines, China, and Taiwan. Now, you've written about how the Chinese have also altered reefs, even built airfields on some. And yet, sir, the China-ASEAN trade is nearing $1 trillion mark. Now, there is complaint about Chinese assertiveness by ASEAN on the one hand, but the mutual economic benefit of trade appears to have completely overridden these anxieties. And India has not really emerged as some kind of an alternative to this just as yet. Why do you think that is, sir?
Pandemic, ASEAN and China have become each other's largest trading partners. Now, this is despite the existence of the South China Sea dispute. On the economic side, it is not that the benefit is entirely to ASEAN. It is entirely to China. The Chinese aggression on the trade side has actually burnt out many ASEAN industries. It has also created supply chains, no doubt, but it has also burnt out industry like textiles in Indonesia and several industries in the Japanese-based automobile industry in several ASEAN countries is being firebombed by the onslaught of Chinese EVs, for instance, right now. So they come and dominate the market, but they also provide BRI kind of funding to develop these countries. Not always, again, on best terms. But yes, it comes. So this economic, you call it engagement, partnership, domination, this is the primary goal of ASEAN currently with China, for which they are willing to put aside the problems in the South China Sea to be discussed in a separate box. Now, the South China Sea problems do not concern all 11 ASEAN countries. They concern five. Four have territorial disputes, and Indonesia has a problem on the EEZ. But each one of them is dealing with it differently, due to which there is no consensus in ASEAN how to deal with China on the code of conduct in the South China Sea. And which is why, despite almost 24 years having gone by, there is no code of conduct, because when China agrees to negotiate with ASEAN, they are not ready because they have no consensus. So they, I think, are easily trading economic gains rather than fight it out with China, which they know they can't. Now, India can play a role by setting up supply chains, possibly with Japan and Australia. We can also provide some kind of defense support, but not to challenge China. So ASEAN look to India as an economic and security balancer. But I don't think we are a net security provider or a net economic partner.
Absolutely. When we talk about economic partnership between India and ASEAN, you've also, of course, discussed in detail about this. Ever since the Act East policy came into operation in the year 2014, it was articulated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It upgraded what was initially called the Look East policy, which was, of course, promulgated when P.V. Narasimha Rao was our Prime Minister in the year 1992. But over the last 10 years, even though trade between India and ASEAN has grown, the trade quantum is still about 8 times less than it is between ASEAN and China. And if we don't wish to compare ourselves to the Chinese at this juncture, because you're dealing with a difference in scale, even then you talk about a concerning aspect of the trade relationship, which is the trade imbalance, which is a very high deficit. So our exports account for about 33% of the overall trade between India and ASEAN. So do you actually see this changing? How big a concern is this? And what can we do to somehow rectify this?
Answer to this is not to keep comparing ourselves with China or with or only look at deficits. The answer is look at a composite where there is trade, investment, services, tourism, all brought together, and then the picture becomes slightly better. Not much better, slightly better. But if you just compare India ASEAN trade with itself, when the ITGA, the ASEAN India Trade in Goods Agreement, was signed, our I think trade was about $25 billion and the deficit was $10 billion. Now the trade is $130 billion and the deficit is $45 billion. It's not out of sync, really. And secondly, I do not think that our deficit with ASEAN is much more than our deficit overall globally. It's same pattern. We also need to understand that this deficit comes from a large import of palm oil, coal, coking coal required by India for its growth, which we import from some ASEAN countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. So that gives a lopsided figure. If you take those out, then the trade is not that bad. Secondly, when we look at this trade imbalance, we don't count services. Services is about $25 billion between India and ASEAN. Very difficult to get these figures, but that is in our favor. So that will bring the deficit down. So I think we need to look at more holistically. And I don't think in today's world, tariff barrier trade should be the determinant of understanding. And we need to look at a more holistic figure which looks at mobility. After look at the number of Indians working in ASEAN,
Yeah.
look at services trade, look at the tourism, all this. So I think this is something that we need to look beyond. Let's not forget India has only 6 entities with whom it has a trade of more than $100 billion. There's China, US, EU, there's the UAE, there's Africa, and there's ASEAN. So this is the big league for us. No, whatever they may trade with us, with China, they are the big league for us. And similarly, the ASEAN 11 trade of $131 billion is not much less than EU 27, which is about $140 billion. So if you are looking purely at trade in goods, this is the reality. So, but yet we spend so much time on Europe and we don't spend that much time on ASEAN.
Let's also explore the defense dimension as well, because you talk about this in the book too. It was first the Philippines and then Indonesia after much back and forth, and finally Vietnam as well, who signed deals to purchase the BrahMos missile system. Was the previous anxiety due to the China factor, and was that another instance of them trying to look over their shoulder to see how the Chinese might react? And if these deals are now going to be operationalized in the near future, what does that say about how that defense relationship has now evolved?
Thank you. So the Look East policy was essentially an economic construct. The Act East policy works across all three ASEAN pillars, which is the political security dimension, the economic dimension, and the socio-cultural. And if you see, since the AEP was launched in 2014, in the last 12 years, the segment which has shown the most hyperactivity is the security dimension. The number of patrolling, coordinated patrols, exercises, the visits of Indian ships, provision of HADR, and now, as you mentioned, the BrahMos. Now, the BrahMos tends to be the cherry on the cake, and that's why it gets talked about so much. Now, Vietnam and Indonesia have been our strategic partners for long. Philippines only became a strategic partner last year, but yet when they realized that they need to challenge China, they looked at India. So Philippines has now come more freely into the Quad orbit. And therefore they look at Japan, Australia, India for closer cooperation in which the BrahMos fits. Whereas Vietnam and Indonesia, who have been talking about BrahMos and Akash for long, have been very slow, even though they are strategic partners. No, I think with Vietnam, definitely it is the China factor. And I think they think India keeps giving them stuff free. And we may very well give the BrahMos free. I don't think that's happening. Whereas with Indonesia, it's normally a budget problem. They come close to buying, then they have a budget problem, then another close to buying. So even now, I think MOD seems to have announced that they are buying. I think MEA is rather discreet about it because I think we really would like to see the payments made. And then we'll say, okay, the deal is through.
Touching upon another dimension in terms of anxieties, the defense anxiety issue has been addressed where at least two countries constantly started looking over their shoulder. But when it comes to the economic relationship, you do also talk about hesitation on the part of certain ASEAN countries, for example, to join India-led initiatives, whether that is the Global Biofuels Alliance or the International Solar Alliance. Not many of them have actually hopped on board. Again, presumably because there might be a China factor looming, because the Chinese clearly do not want to see an India-led initiative acquire this kind of traction. Will they ever overcome that? Do you see that as a big obstacle in terms of achieving the kind of potential that India-ASEAN ties can actually do?
You are looking at ASEAN Action United. That is a big disappointment because neither the Solar Alliance, nor CDRI, nor Biofuel, nor the Big Cat Alliance has ASEAN ever taken it seriously. Though Prime Minister Modi had offered them the Solar Alliance even before the Solar Alliance was launched in his speech in 2014 to the ASEAN Summit and the EAS. But I think as a collective, they have to work on consensus, and all countries within ASEAN don't think alike. Some of them are very close to China. But now, slowly, when the advantages are being known, individual ASEAN countries are linking up with India, whether on the ISA or on the CDRI or on the big cats. It makes sense for them to engage with biofuels, no? After all, look at their palm oil plantation. They are not oil surplus countries. So I think slowly this realization is dawning. But now we are not trying for ASEAN solutions. We are trying for what in the book I've called ASEAN plus solutions. Work with those countries willing to step out of the ASEAN ambit and take independent positions.
Now, interestingly, I mean, we're big on FTAs now, but the ASEAN bloc was one of those blocs where we actually signed an FTA almost 16 years ago, in the year 2010. But obviously, there is a strong prevailing view now that the FTA needs to be reviewed because a lot has happened between then and now. What kind of a shape should a future FTA take? And do you see that materializing in the near future? Given the reservations that each side might have. And I also asked this in the backdrop of the entire RCEP episode, which I'll of course ask you again a bit later in the interview. But is that baggage weighing heavily on the operationalizing of a concrete future FTA with ASEAN?
It indeed does. ASEAN often talks about trust, and I often tell them, for us, the trust is how you implement the IT. That is trust. Because there is distrust in India on how they implement. Now, had we been in RCEP, the ITGA would have become irrelevant. But we are not in RCEP. So once we withdrew from RCEP, we refocused attention on ITGA. Now, ITGA is a badly negotiated agreement. It only covers trade. Services and investment came 5 years later. We should have actually had a SEPA kind of an agreement where you covered all aspects in one, which that we missed the boat. So now we are again trying to get ITGA under the review to cover items of our interest on human mobility, on services, on investment. And ASEAN keeps resisting, saying they are not part of this, they're not part of this. And ASEAN knows that we want to essentially control their disguised exports, which come from China. But they say that as per the China FTA, they are doing enough to justify the rule of origin, enough value added. But under our FTA, that may be enough, but it is disguised. So that contradiction remains. Had
And
we gone to RCEP, this would have been covered, no?
yes.
So this problem is that we wanted this done in 2024. They said end of 2025. Now we are in August 2026. Still no conclusion of review because essentially it is stuck on that. And then our most strategic partners, Indonesia and Vietnam, they are the most tardy in giving you market access. So those are the major problems.
Coming to the entire RCEP episode and the circumstances in which India chose to withdraw. Now, you also cited some experts who would actually come out with a review of that entire episode, and they basically ended up coming to the conclusion that ASEAN or countries within the ASEAN viewed India's withdrawal from the RCEP as a breach, as a betrayal of trust, to put it strongly. But net, the decision to actually withdraw from RCEP has been vindicated in more ways than one, and perhaps in hindsight, it was the right call to take. A couple of things that I'd like to touch upon is the view within ASEAN that India's withdrawal was not reasonable. Does it carry any merit whatsoever? That's point number one. And point number two, you dwell on internal dynamics in terms of negotiations, even on the Indian side, where the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce were not always on the same page. They appear to have a different set of priorities in between themselves. Give us an insight into that as well, sir.
When I was the ambassador to ASEAN in 2012, when the RCEP started, the Ministry of Commerce was not interested. I had to push really hard to say what kind of look east policy are we running if we are not part of the largest FTA happening in this region. So we entered it for strategic reasons. We seem to have withdrawn for strategic. But I still believe we should be a part of RCEP for strategic reasons. We should learn to be a pain to others rather than only suffer pain. Now, if you see during the RCEP negotiations, three countries were very difficult for us: China, Australia, and New Zealand. But in the last 2 years, Australia and New Zealand have had strategic dawning. And now they have both signed kinds of CPAs or CCAs with us, which allows some kind of modicum of trade without emphasizing on dairy, which was always their point. So today, of all the RCEP countries, the only country we are left without an agreement is China, which is the problem. Second point is that ASEAN countries looked at us as a balance to China, but in no effective way. We were left to fight our own battles. ASEAN countries say, whatever your red lines, you should have told us earlier. You told us only at the end, meaning that your negotiating style was poor. In our case, my book has shown the amount of internal contradictions we were dealing with was immense. Essentially, the price of RCEP was for all those other 15 countries to gain access to the Indian market. And today, when that market is not there, the honest people say RCEP has lost much of its meaning. It's only a way that China dominates you, not you enter China, because Chinese non-tariff barriers are very high. I think since RCEP came into force, I think 2022, there is only an 8% increase in intra-RCEP trade, which is nothing significant. So I think the cherry, which was India, is missing. So that is something they feel the loss. So should we go back to RCEP? I think given the problem with China, we won't. So therefore, I have been saying that India should look at the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, in which there's no United States, no China, but all our other friends from the region are there. It calls for much higher reform. And we have been accepting things with EU and UK. So why not look here? And I think if we put CPTPP as our cardinal focus, I think we will be much better served economically and strategically.
A final couple of questions, Mr. Singh. In terms of regional connectivity, which is, of course, a very strong part of our relationship with ASEAN, a lot has been articulated in terms of the vision, but not a lot has materialized, and that also owes itself to geopolitical tensions in our neighborhood and the state of affairs in countries like Myanmar and also now Bangladesh post Hasina. Um, so therefore, how much does our relationship with ASEAN in strategic terms and also in terms of trade, partly because I'm talking about interconnectivity corridors, etc., that we've been trying to achieve, how much are they actually dependent on these geopolitical factors, and is there really a lot that we can influence on that front? Because there's a lot that we may or may not be able to control about what happens in our immediate neighborhood.
You're very right. So one of the elements of the Act East policy was to improve the connectivity between India and the Northeast using Bangladesh and Myanmar. So these two countries were critical. And given the fact that they have a real, tendency to slip into instability frequently, we have to keep balancing them. Right now, we are suffering because both are imbalanced. Normally, you could live with one. So the Kaladan multimodal project, which linked West Bengal to Mizoram through Myanmar, that was a good thing, but it only works in fits and starts. Many of the other things like the railway, the road, the pipelines through Bangladesh to Tripura and all, another one. But the trilateral highway, which goes through Myanmar and Thailand, that was meant to facilitate trade. But there's very little on the Indian side in the Northeast that you can trade. If you open that highway whenever, you will basically invite Thailand sending in stuff through Myanmar, which is largely disguised Chinese goods. So I am never convinced that that was a good idea. because you should set up a connectivity where you have a strong economy on one side, which will send goods. Here we will be the recipient. To my mind, the Mysuru, Bengaluru, Chennai, or Mysuru, Bengaluru, Vizag, these industrial corridors need more potent engagement with Southeast Asia. And we should have facilitated that through port connectivity and shipping and such stuff and supply chain linkages. Those are not being really built up. And if that had happened, then our existing industrial corridors would have got space in ASEAN either to export there or to become a part of their supply chains. So, those different approaches.
So finally, to conclude, I mean, what next for India-ASEAN ties? Is there a certain mental block that both India as well as ASEAN need to overcome in the immediate future to take the ties to the next level? Do you see them overcoming that? Do you see a tangible change in approaches in the recent past? Is there scope for more hope in terms of the relationship living up to its potential? Because it promises a lot. Obviously, the achievements have not been quite proportionate. Do you see that changing in the near future, sir?
So, when you again you look at individual ASEAN member states, Malaysia, semiconductors, Indonesia, rare earth supply chain, Philippines, a defense supply chain. These are all emerging things, which makes sense, no? But I think if you want to look at holistically, I would say this. India and ASEAN now realize that the world is getting divided and it is not heading to multipolarity, which is preferable to us, but heading to bipolarity, which we don't want. So, therefore, all the more reason to look directly at each other, shake each other's hands, and remember that bipolarity can be fought by creating more options of cooperation. And that is what I think India and ASEAN will work on, not as an ASEAN whole, but as individual expansion of relations with specific ASEAN countries in different fields as useful to them.
Finally, sir, just a quick follow-up. How do the ASEAN countries themselves, based on your extensive experience having served in that part of the world, how do they see the relevance of the bloc going forward? Uh, because they have differences of opinion on multiple issues themselves, and no formation or a bloc can necessarily have a coherent, unified view over a lot of things. So, how do ASEAN countries themselves look at the bloc in terms of negotiating as a bloc with prospective trading and regional partners and international partners? Final question.
So that is the problem. The unity and centrality of ASEAN is the buzzword. But over recent years, the unity of ASEAN has taken a big hit. They are not united on Myanmar, which is a member of ASEAN. They are not united on the Ukraine crisis, Iran crisis, Gaza crisis. They all have different views. And they don't have, except for expressing concern, no common statements. Similarly, when it comes to dealing, let's say, with the United States on tariffs, they don't have a common tariff. Each one is hit with a different tariff. So each one is negotiating separately. So I think this united view, yes, generally they believe they are being discriminated against, but individually they have to fight it out or accommodate. But where the centrality is concerned, that has also taken a hit because they are not able to deliver. But if you see the recent meetings of foreign ministers in Manila, which also included the meeting of the ASEAN Regional Forum, the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and such things. A lot of people come there because it is still got not the leadership, but the convening power of this centrality. The amount of fora they provide, people come and you can meet a lot of people there at one time. So it's still that convening power of regional and global conversations is still important to ASEAN. But yes, their ability to deliver on real issues is becoming more and more strangled because they have to take individual.
Absolutely. We'll wait and see as to how things evolve. But many thanks for sharing your perspective with us, Ambassador Singh, and congratulations once again on your book, The Durian Flavor, India and ASEAN After a Decade of the ACTES Policy. We've only touched upon a few issues that the book addresses. There's, of course, a whole lot more that you've explored in the book. Many thanks, Mr. Singh, once again for joining us and
Thank
sharing
you,
your thoughts.
Siddharth. Very happy to be with you. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Take care.